report out today offers a glimpse into the framework for community-level reparations that would address the negative impact the war on drugs had on neighborhoods on the city's south side.
It's part of a 2-year study by the Chicago Urban League. Andrew Ramos is listening to you and has more on what the report uncovered.
A drive on the south side of Chicago reveals not only a rich history, but at times a troubling one. Many of the neighborhoods here suffered disproportionately from the so-called war on drugs, where high rates of incarcerations leveled communities, shattering families. Decades later, the south side is still recovering. In an effort to reinvest and repair the damage done to the community, the Chicago Urban League spearheaded a wide-ranging study outlining just how reparations could right these wrongs.
Not only thinking about this, but acting.
Funding for reparations, they proposed, would come directly from revenue generated from the state's cannabis sales tax. The 2-year study involved interviews and group discussions with 200 residents from 10 predominantly black Southside neighborhoods, including Inglewood, South Shore, Woodlawn, and Bronzeville.
All of the things that many black people have to think about when it comes to money, we had an opportunity to explore that with folks on the south and west sides.
The 5 areas of focus in the study were civil legal aid, community economic development, re-entry into life outside prison, youth development, and violence prevention. One of the most notable takeaways from the report, respondents agreed that there must be a balance between providing community-based reparations and reparations given to individuals.
People know what they need in their community, and they know, the avenues to take it, but it's we just need that final push of the government officials and the people who have the money to actually put it into the community.
While it's a mere framework for how the reparations would play out, researchers concluded more work needs to be done locally and nationally on the effort, where community input needs to play a central role. Reporting on the South Side, Andrew Ramos, CBS News Chicago.
The Chicago Urban League released its report from the South Side Community Reparations Coalition called Reparations Are for Individuals.
People know what they need in their community, and they know the avenues to take it, but it's we just need that final push of the government officials and the people who have the money to actually put it into the community.
The coalition found residents want to see reparations to individuals who are descendants of slaves and systemic changes to improve the quality of life for descendants and ultimately improve our communities. North of Chicago, Evanston has distributed more than $5 million in reparations to descendants of residents who had been the victims of housing discrimination. Caitlin Johnson was among the 200 people interviewed for the report. She can trace her ancestors to slavery.
Just money in and of itself is not the solution. It really has to be a menu of options. It really has to be a buffet even, where folks can get what they need based off of their own family's experience.
A white family had a house, a black family didn't have it. They don't have the wealth that comes with that real estate to then pass down.
Between the 1970s and early 90s, one Chicago detective named John Burge was accused of torturing up to 200 mostly black men while they were in police custody. In order to score a confession, victims say Burge and his midnight crew subjected them to fake executions, suffocation, burning, and electric shocks with cattle prods. In 2008, Burge was indicted.
The people in police custody that were abused and tortured were suspected of awful crimes, but that is no excuse. Torture and abuse have no place in Chicago Police Station.
This year, the city officially apologized and set up a reparations fund. But because of the statute of limitations, Burge was never officially charged with torture. Instead, he was convicted of lying in a civil case. He spent less than 4 years in prison and still receives a pension. Fast forward to 2015 when another Chicago PD bombshell was dropped. Journalists uncovered that the police were running an off-the-books holding facility in an old Sears building, basically a black site. The investigation found that police used the site, known as Home and Square, to essentially disappear suspects for hours or days at a time while interrogating them. Of the 7,000 people that are known to have been brought in, only 68 were allowed access to a lawyer or to call their families. And the suspects held were overwhelmingly black and mostly detained for drug possession. The Chicago PD, for its part, says it abides by all rules when interrogating people at Home and Square. An official investigation is slated for this month. The decades of secrets and abuse runs deep. In the last 4 years, 97% of almost 30,000 citizen complaints against officers have resulted in no punishment. Whistleblowers within the police department say there's a culture of fear where anyone who points the finger at corruption is punished or ostracized. So with decades of police abuse and corruption, can a mayor's apology really fix anything? And what will?
We do need more cops because, see, if you don't have enough and they're tied to that radio all day, that's all they can do. They don't have time to get to know the people in their communities. They don't have time to do proactive stuff. They don't have time to do officer friendly things because they're so busy answering the radio calls. So 1,400, that's not good. It's not in a city with 2.7 million people.
Last November, 15 men in Chicago came to the courthouse and were exonerated altogether.
They're men who all served time for crimes they say they didn't commit. Now the county's top prosecutor agrees with them.
Because of crooked police investigation.
It was believed to be the first mass exoneration in Cook County history.
Let's talk about some of the main characters in the story, starting with Ronald Watts. Who is he and what kind of a person is he?
Ronald Watts was a sergeant in the Chicago Police Department. Their job was to root out the drug trafficking and the drug dealing going on in the Ida B. Wells homes. What they were actually doing, in fact, or what he was actually doing, is running his own sort of criminal enterprise, shaking down drug dealers, shaking down other residents of the projects and demanding money from them, bribes. He was planting drugs, heroin, cocaine, on residents and hauling them to the precinct and then off to jail. When I would ask some of the men who had been arrested by him how they would describe him, some of them would talk about training day, about the corrupt detective.
All right, I'm putting cases on all you bitches. Huh? You think you can do this shit? I'm the police. I run shit here. You just live here.
All right, the story takes place primarily in a housing project on the south side of Chicago that no longer exists, but it was called the Ida B. Wells Homes. And it was opened in 1941. It was the first housing project in Chicago that was built specifically for African Americans. It was segregated housing. And at the time was a place of tremendous promise. It really embodied the aspirations of the entire neighborhood. And then over the decades, the Chicago Housing Authority neglected their buildings. The place became incredibly run down. You have graffiti, you have gunshots, you have, open air drug dealing. So it's a very, very challenging place to grow up. I think of all the folks that were affected by this corruption, it seemed to me that Ben and Clarissa Baker paid the very highest price. Ben and Clarissa are a couple who met in 1990 in night school on the south side of Chicago. He grew up in the Ida B. Wells homes, and she grew up about half a mile away. She came from a middle-class family. Her father was a private detective. And they became a couple, and they had 3 boys. And she ultimately moves into the Ida B. Wells. They really traced their troubles with Sergeant Watts back to 2004, the sergeant asking him for money, and he refused. Ultimately, at the end of 2005, they're driving down the street together into the Ida B. Wells, into the parking lot by their building, and police officer comes up behind them and another beside them. And here is Sergeant Watts and one of his officers, demanding their keys, demanding that they get out of the car, and searching the whole car. They see Sergeant Watts put his hand inside the door, and as they remember, he pulls out his hand and he says, "I got it." Clarissa tells me that she saw something come out of his sleeve. And fast forward several months, Ben now has 2 pending drug cases. He goes on trial in Chicago and ultimately is convicted despite testifying in his own defense, despite his lawyer telling the whole story about the bribes and the corruption going on in Ida B. Wells, and he's sentenced ultimately to 14 years in prison. And it rips the family apart. From what Clarissa has told me, it sounds like it was so deeply traumatic what happened. And here she is, a single mom with 3 kids to raise, by herself. Because she had been convicted in this case with Ben, she's now a convicted felon, which of course means it's much harder to find a decent paying job. You can't get Section 8, which is a federal rental subsidy. So life just becomes infinitely harder.
How was Officer Watts finally exposed?
In 2012, when Ben Baker was in prison and had been in prison for some 6 years, one night he's on the cell block. It's nighttime. Folks are getting ready to go to sleep, and somebody telling him, turn the TV on, turn the TV on. He turns it on, and there's Sergeant Watts sprinting down the street on the news with one of his officers. As it turns out, Sergeant Watts has been arrested. This is in early 2012. He and one of his officers were arrested for what was called theft of government funds. So even after Sergeant Watts went to prison, he was sentenced to 22 months, Ben Baker was still in prison. In 2015, at the same time that there was a lawyer, Joshua Tepfer, at the Exoneration Project in Chicago, putting together a petition trying to get Ben Baker out of prison, folks were protesting in the streets the murder of Laquan McDonald by a Chicago police officer. The videotape had never been released, so it was only through the efforts of folks in Chicago pushing very hard to get a judge to order the release of that tape that it was out. And once folks saw the way this teenager had died at the hands of a police shooting, they took to the streets.
16 shots! 16 shots!
And that rage and frustration really changed the tone, I think, of the conversation around criminal justice and helped bring in a new state's attorney, a woman named Kim Fox, who ultimately is the person who made the decision about the mass exoneration.
2 Chicago police officers who blew the whistle on a gang of their colleagues after they discovered they were demanding bribes from drug dealers in the housing projects of Chicago, arresting their rivals and blocking any internal investigations into their actions. The 2 whistleblowers, Shannon Spalding and her partner, Danny Echeverria, spent 5 years working with the Chicago Police Department and the FBI in their case, only to be sidelined, outed as informants, threatened, and eventually forced out of the police department. In contrast, the named senior officials and cops who helped cover for their fellow officers were able to retire from the force with their pensions intact and face no punishment for their role in the cover-up. Spalding says she has even received death threats. She and her partner both took stress-related medical leaves, and she's been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder.
Their ordeal is chronicled in a 4-part investigation published by The Intercept called The Code of Silence. Part 1 is headlined, "In the Chicago Police Department, if the bosses say it didn't happen, it didn't happen." It's written by the award-winning Chicago journalist Jamie Calvin, who's made a career of exposing police misconduct in Chicago. He spent 3 years interviewing Spalding for the report. He's also known for uncovering the autopsy report that showed Laquan McDonald was shot 16 times by Chicago police in 2004, and was the first to report on the existence of the video of the shooting, which was released 400 days after McDonald was killed. Thursday marked the 2nd anniversary of the killing. Calvin is now working with Spalding on a project called the Invisible Institute, which has set up an encrypted Dropbox for Chicago police officers to anonymously upload evidence of corruption. They also offer to link whistleblowing cops to mental health and legal resources. For more, we go to Chicago, where Jamie Calvin joins us to discuss the investigation. And we're joined by the whistleblower at the center of his story, Shannon Spalding. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Jamie, let's begin with you. Lay out this story.
So this is really a Serpico saga for our time of two narcotics officers who undercover a massive criminal enterprise, as your setup said, in high-rise public housing in Chicago during its last decade of existence. It's all been demolished now. So the scene of the crime has essentially disappeared. They make conscientious efforts to bring this criminal activity to the attention of their superiors. They're blown off, ultimately go to the FBI and provide information. It's not conclusive information, but grounds for investigation. They then are detailed to work undercover with the FBI and pursue this investigation for a number of years, are at the point of breaking the case wide open when they are outed within the department and have since suffered constant retaliation. I think part of what is really important about this story is what it illustrates about the nature of the Code of Silence. You know, I think the common understanding of the Code of Silence is it's a kind of peer-to-peer phenomena of the rank and file. We're in the foxhole together. You've got my back. I've got mine. Nobody likes a tattletale. There certainly is that dimension within police culture. But what's so striking about this story is that the retaliation against these officers is ordered by high-ranking supervisory officials within the department. So it's really a story in great detail of how the Code of Silence operates at the center of the Chicago Police Department.
Well, Jamie, about this issue of retaliation being ordered at high levels, how was that documented in the lawsuit? And also, the city settled for $2 million before there was a trial. Could you talk about the tactic of the city of settling the suit?
Right. So there was in the midst of this ordeal, the two officers, Shannon and Danny, brought a whistleblower lawsuit, really an employment suit, hoping above all to be protected from further retaliation. It only compounded and intensified the retaliation at that point. There are a number of allegations in the lawsuit, and the Intercept piece links to all the underlying legal documents. But, you know, supervisors, the commander of narcotics, the chief of organized crime, made it clear that they did not want these officers working in units that they controlled. They went so far in one instance of really delivering a threat, and paradoxically the threat was conveyed by the chief of internal affairs, who's charged with investigating this sort of thing, a threat against their personal safety. You know, I believe the quote was, if they call for backup, it's not coming. So, you know, this was not just a matter of being ostracized or shunned within the department, although it certainly was that. These, as Shannon says at one point in the article, I quote her saying, you know, we were officers without a department. So they're left out on the streets in this really dangerous investigation, investigating a team of officers who are thought to have been implicated in 2 murders. It hasn't been proven yet, but it's scarcely been investigated apart from Shannon and Danny's work. And they're kind of left wholly exposed. So, and this was coming from the top. This wasn't some kind of, you know, aberrant behavior. This is really the machinery of how the Chicago Police Department controls the narrative. Amy quoted the line about, you know, if 4 of the bosses say it didn't happen, it didn't happen. That's really what's at the center of this story.
Let's go to Shannon Spalding, former Chicago police officer. On May 31st, Chicago agrees to settle a whistleblower lawsuit brought by Shannon Spalding and her colleague Daniel Echeverria, who allege they suffered retaliation for reporting investigating criminal activity by fellow officers.